The stairwell exploded in a shower of concrete and twisted metal. Thomas Griffin felt the shockwave slam into his chest as he pressed against the wall, ears ringing like church bells on Sunday morning. Smoke filled the narrow corridor, thick and acrid, mixing with the smell of cordite and something else, something that made his stomach clench. The young TOO fighter beside him was hyperventilating, rifle barrel wavering like a compass needle. Griffin was 63 years old, a former Green Beret who'd spent 22 years teaching urban combat tactics at Fort Bragg before retirement claimed him. Staff Sergeant, 5th Special Forces Group, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. He'd come to Ukraine not for glory or politics, but because sitting in his empty Denver apartment watching the news felt like drowning in slow motion. His wife Sarah had passed 2 years ago, cancer, and his son barely called anymore. Teaching mall cops defensive tactics wasn't enough. The Ukrainian International Legion needed instructors, and Griffin needed purpose. Before we continue, if you believe stories like this still matter, hit subscribe. Your support keeps them alive. The improvised explosive device on the 3rd floor landing had taken Martinez clean off his feet. The kid from El Paso wasn't moving, his gear scattered across the rubble-strewn floor. Griffin could hear voices below, Russian, urgent, getting closer. Someone was calling for help in Ukrainian, the sound echoing up through the building's hollow bones. Through the settling dust, Griffin saw movement on the landing above. 2 figures, maybe 3. His M4 felt familiar in his hands, an old friend from a different century. The TOO fighter was looking at him with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for orders that might get them all sent home in boxes. From somewhere in the basement, a voice cried out in pain. The contact came fast and dirty, exactly how Griffin remembered it from Fallujah. The first Russian appeared at the top of the stairs, rifle leading, and Griffin put 2 rounds center mass before the man could blink. The body tumbled backward with a wet thud. The second fighter tried to use the bathroom doorway for cover, but these weren't seasoned professionals, just conscripts who'd learned tactics from video games. Griffin moved up the stairs like he was 40 again, muscle memory overriding the arthritis in his knees. The TO kid stayed close, finally remembering to check his corners. The bathroom door hung on twisted hinges, and Griffin could see muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness beyond. He cooked a grenade for 2 seconds, then rolled it through the doorway. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. When the smoke cleared, 1 Russian was down for good. The other sat against the bathtub, hands raised, blood streaming from his nose. He couldn't have been older than 19, with scared rabbit eyes and a uniform that hung loose on his skinny frame. Griffin zip-tied his hands while the kid covered the stairs. The radio crackled with static and urgent Ukrainian voices, but Griffin couldn't make out the words through the interference. His headset was damaged, probably from the blast. They had the building, but at what cost? Martinez was gone and their communications were down to hand signals and shouting. That's when they heard it again, that voice from the basement, weaker now but still calling for help. It wasn't Russian. Griffin looked at his watch. 20 minutes until extraction. The smart play was to hold the perimeter and wait, but someone was dying down there in the dark. The basement stairs descended into a tomb of shadows and stale air. Griffin led with his rifle light cutting through the darkness. The TOO fighter close behind. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, and the smell hit them halfway down, blood, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear. They found them in what used to be a storage room. A Ukrainian soldier, maybe 25, sat propped against concrete blocks with a tourniquet around his left thigh. The fabric of his uniform was dark with blood, but his eyes were alert, tracking Griffin's movement. Beside him, a Russian sergeant lay on his side, breathing shallow and fast. His uniform bore the insignia of a motor rifle regiment, and his face was gray with blood loss. Griffin knelt between them, his medic training kicking in after decades of dormancy. The Ukrainian had taken a rifle round through the meat of his thigh, painful, but manageable with proper treatment. The Russian's wound was different. Entry hole low on his right side, no exit wound. Internal bleeding, possibly nicked artery. Without immediate surgery, he had maybe 30 minutes. Griffin's kit held 2 tourniquets. He'd already used one upstairs on Martinez before realizing the kid was beyond help. That left him with 1 tourniquet and 2 men who needed it. The Ukrainian grabbed his sleeve with blood-sticky fingers, eyes pleading. The Russian sergeant just stared at the ceiling, lips moving in what might have been prayer. His radio squawked with broken transmissions. Extraction window closing. Decision time approaching like incoming artillery. Griffin had made choices like this before, in places where mercy was a luxury and time was the enemy. But those decisions never got easier, no matter how many years passed. In 15 minutes, they'd have to move. Only one man was walking out of this basement alive. Griffin stared at both wounded men, his mind racing through protocols drilled into him over 2 decades of service. The Geneva Convention was clear about prisoners of war, but so were the tactical realities of a hot extraction zone. The Russian sergeant was conscious now, eyes fixed on Griffin, with a mixture of fear and resignation that reminded him of other young faces in other dark places. The TOO fighter shifted nervously behind him, rifle trained on the stairwell. Above them, boots moved across the floors they'd just cleared. Friendly forces securing the building, but for how long? Intelligence suggested this sector would be under counterattack within the hour. Griffin knew what headquarters would want. Live prisoners meant intelligence, and intelligence meant saved lives down the line. The Russian wore the stripes of a senior non-commissioned officer, exactly the kind of source that could provide enemy positions, unit strengths, planned movements. The Ukrainian soldier was brave, no doubt, but he was just infantry, expendable by the cold mathematics of warfare. The wounded Ukrainian spoke his name with an accent that reminded Griffin of his neighbor's kid back in Denver. Same age, same earnest face, same way of looking at the world like it owed him a future. The Russian sergeant said nothing, but his eyes held the weight of decisions yet unmade. Griffin's hands moved to his medical kit, feeling the weight of the remaining tourniquet. Every second of hesitation was blood loss, was decreased chances, was another choice spiraling toward inevitability. The radio crackled again. 5 minutes to extraction. No time for debate, no time for committee decisions, just an old soldier and the weight of 2 lives balanced on the edge of a blade. Above them, someone was shouting orders in Ukrainian. Time to move. Griffin's decision came without conscious thought, muscle memory and moral instinct overriding tactical calculation. He applied the tourniquet to the Ukrainian soldier's thigh, tightening it until the bleeding stopped. The young man's face went pale but determined, understanding what the choice meant for the Russian beside them. The sergeant watched them prepare to leave, his breathing growing more labored. No accusation in his eyes, just the quiet acceptance of a professional soldier who understood the mathematics of survival. Griffin left him his water bottle and a field dressing, knowing it wouldn't matter much but unable to do nothing. Getting the wounded Ukrainian up those stairs took both of them, Griffin supporting most of the weight while the TRO fighter covered their ascent. Rain had started falling outside, turning the building's debris into slick hazards. Each step was agony for the wounded man, but he bit down on his pain and kept moving. They reached the ground floor as the extraction vehicles arrived. 2 armored personnel carriers grinding through the rubble-strewn street. Griffin could hear the Ukrainian calling goodbye to someone left behind, voice breaking. The sound would follow him for days. As they loaded the wounded man into the APC, a reconnaissance drone buzzed overhead, enemy surveillance cataloging their movements, counting their numbers. Griffin pressed against the building's wall, watching the small aircraft circle like a mechanical vulture. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, they waited in the rain while death studied them from above. When the drone finally moved on, they could hear sounds from the basement again. Weaker now, but still there. The Russian was dying alone in the dark, and somewhere in enemy territory, His comrades were planning their next move, with one less intelligence source to worry about. Griffin climbed into the APC, knowing he'd saved one life and sacrificed strategic advantage in the process. The extraction convoy reached the forward operating base as evening settled over the Ukrainian countryside. Medical personnel rushed the wounded soldier into a field hospital, while Griffin gave his after-action report to an intelligence officer who looked young enough to be his grandson. Standard questions: enemy strength, positions, equipment observed. The officer seemed more interested in what they hadn't brought back. Griffin sat in the debriefing tent, rain drumming against canvas walls while he explained his decision in clinical terms: resources available, time constraints, tactical priorities. He didn't mention the way the Ukrainian had said his name, or how the Russian sergeant had reminded him of soldiers he'd known in better wars. The intelligence officer nodded and made notes, but his expression suggested disappointment. Later in the quiet of the sleeping quarters, one of the Ukrainian fighters approached Griffin. The man thanked him for bringing their comrade home, called it the right choice, the moral choice. Griffin accepted the gratitude without comment, his mind already elsewhere, remembering another basement in another war where different calculations had led to different outcomes. The radio traffic that night was heavy with encrypted communications, but one message came through clearly enough. Enemy forces had recovered a wounded soldier from the target building. Intelligence suggested he was providing information about Ukrainian unit positions and tactics. The tactical cost of Griffin's decision was already becoming apparent. By morning, they knew the full price. A Ukrainian patrol had walked into an ambush 3 kilometers south of their position. 12 casualties, including 4 dead. The enemy had known exactly where to wait, exactly when the patrol would arrive. Information that could have come from only one source. Griffin stared at his coffee and wondered how many more would die because he'd chosen mercy over mission requirements. The next operation briefing would ask different questions and expect different answers. The inquiry came 3 days later, conducted in a prefabricated building that served as divisional headquarters. Griffin sat across from a colonel whose fresh uniform and clean shave marked him as rear echelon staff. The questions came in measured cadences, each one designed to establish culpability for what had become known as the Avdiivka incident. Griffin answered with military precision: resource limitations, time constraints, tactical necessity. The colonel's aide took notes while outside. Helicopters ferried wounded soldiers to medical facilities that were running out of beds. The mathematics of Griffin's choice had rippled outward, touching lives he'd never see, families he'd never meet. The colonel wanted to know who had authorized the deviation from standard prisoner collection protocols. Griffin explained that battlefield conditions had required immediate decision-making. The colonel wanted to know why intelligence priorities had been subordinated to humanitarian concerns. Griffin said time hadn't permitted detailed analysis of strategic value. What he didn't say was how the young Ukrainian had looked at him with trust that reminded Griffin of his own son at that age. What he didn't mention was the Russian sergeant's quiet dignity in facing death alone. The inquiry wasn't interested in moral complexity, only operational efficiency. The session ended with a notation in Griffin's personnel file: failure to maximize tactical intelligence opportunities. The colonel suggested that future decisions should prioritize mission objectives over personal sentiment. Griffin acknowledged the guidance and left without comment. That evening, word came from the field hospital. The Ukrainian soldier they'd rescued had died during surgery, complications from blood loss and delayed treatment. Internal bleeding they hadn't detected in the basement's darkness. Griffin had saved a man who died anyway, while sacrificing intelligence that might have prevented other deaths. In the operations tent, someone was asking whether experienced advisors understood current tactical realities, or if age was becoming a liability in modern warfare. Griffin's next assignment was inventory management at the supply depot, counting ammunition cases and maintaining equipment manifests. The work kept him away from operational planning, away from battlefield decisions, away from opportunities to make the wrong choice again. He performed the duties without complaint, understanding the message being delivered through bureaucratic channels. The Ukrainian fighters who'd served with him offered polite greetings when their paths crossed, but conversations remained brief and professional. Everyone knew about the inquiry, about the missed intelligence opportunity, about the subsequent casualties. Griffin had become a cautionary example of sentiment overruling tactical necessity. His knees ached more in the morning now, joints protesting against concrete floors and metal shelving. The Ukrainian winter was settling in with characteristic harshness, and the depot's heating system worked sporadically at best. Griffin found himself moving slower, thinking longer about decisions that used to be automatic. Age was catching up to choices made in younger decades. The isolation wasn't complete. Occasionally, intelligence summaries crossed his desk, and he could track the consequences of that basement decision spreading through the tactical situation like cracks in ice. Enemy forces seemed to anticipate Ukrainian movements with increasing accuracy. Positions were compromised before assaults began. Supply convoys hit ambushes that suggested detailed prior knowledge. Sleep came harder now, interrupted by dreams of wounded men in dark basements and young faces asking questions that had no good answers. Griffin had made similar choices in Afghanistan and Iraq, but this felt different, more personal, more consequential. The weight of other people's sons balanced against abstract tactical advantages. In his small quarters after midnight, Griffin wrote letters to his own son that he never sent, trying to explain decisions that couldn't be explained, seeking forgiveness for choices that seemed right in the moment, but wrong in the aftermath. Outside, snow began falling on a country where young men were learning the mathematics of survival. January brought temperatures that made Griffin's old wounds ache with renewed intensity. Shrapnel fragments from Kandahar, a knife scar from Baghdad, compression fractures from too many parachute landings. All of them announced the weather with arthritic precision. The supply depot's concrete floor felt like ice beneath his boots, and the space heater in his quarters had given up working entirely. Nobody spoke to him anymore beyond operational necessity. The Ukrainian fighters he'd trained regarded him with polite distance, their respect tempered by awareness of his tactical liability. Command staff included him in briefings only when regulation required it, otherwise managing operations around his presence like water flowing around a stone. Griffin had become invisible, a 63-year-old reminder of sentiment's cost in modern warfare. His experience meant nothing if his judgment couldn't be trusted. His expertise was worthless if his decisions compromised missions. The war was being fought by younger men who understood current realities, while he counted supplies and filed reports about equipment maintenance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered through military postal channels. The Ukrainian soldier's family had tracked down his address, wanting to express gratitude for bringing their son home. His brother wrote in careful English about funeral arrangements, about a young man who died believing someone cared enough to risk everything for his life. Griffin read the letter 3 times before filing it away, another weight added to a burden that already threatened to crush him. The gratitude felt worse than condemnation, emphasizing the gap between intention and outcome. He'd saved a man who died anyway, while tactical consequences continued rippling outward through operations he no longer influenced. That night, alone in his quarters with only the sound of wind through broken windows, Griffin wondered if his son would attend his funeral, or if the distance between them had become insurmountable. Some choices left scars that never healed, some decisions echoed across decades, and some wars followed soldiers home regardless of geographical distance. Outside, snow continued falling on graves that would never be visited. The summons came through official channels, report to divisional headquarters for reassignment consultation. Griffin expected discharge paperwork, a polite suggestion that his services were no longer required. Instead, he found himself facing a different colonel, one whose uniform showed field experience and whose eyes held the weight of recent losses. The situation had changed. The colonel explained, heavy casualties among experienced urban warfare instructors had created training gaps that were costing lives. New recruits were arriving with insufficient preparation for close-quarters combat, and operational effectiveness was suffering accordingly. Griffin's background in teaching urban tactics made him valuable again, despite recent complications. The reassignment was clear: training facility outside Kramatorsk, working with international volunteers and Ukrainian recruits who needed intensive preparation for city fighting. No operational decisions, no prisoner handling, no basement choices that could compromise intelligence opportunities. Just teaching young men how to stay alive in environments where death waited around every corner. Griffin accepted the assignment without enthusiasm, recognizing it as both opportunity and exile. He would be useful again, but at arm's length, from consequences that might result from emotional decision-making. The army needed his expertise while containing his liability, a solution that satisfied operational requirements without acknowledging moral complexity. The transport to Kramatorsk took 6 hours through countryside marked by war's passage. Destroyed villages, abandoned farmhouses, fields cratered by artillery strikes. Griffin watched the landscape scroll past, thinking about lessons learned and prices paid, about young men who would depend on his instruction to survive encounters with enemies who showed no mercy. At the training facility he found familiar faces among the new arrivals. The TRO fighter from the Avdiivka operation was there, promoted to squad leader and assigned to train newer volunteers. The young man smiled when he saw Griffin, genuine warmth in his expression despite everything that had happened since their last meeting. Some students were worth the risk of teaching, regardless of institutional judgment about tactical reliability. The first class began the next morning. The training compound echoed with gunfire and shouted commands as Griffin worked with his latest class of urban warfare students. These weren't green recruits, fresh from civilian life, but experienced fighters who'd learned hard lessons in places like Mariupol and Severodonetsk. They came to him with scars and stories, seeking techniques that might keep them alive through the next urban assault. Griffin found his rhythm again, muscle memory and teaching instinct, overriding months of institutional exile. Room-clearing procedures, stairwell tactics, close-quarters marksmanship, skills honed through decades of training and combat, passed down to young men who would face enemies in spaces where hesitation meant death. The work felt clean in ways that battlefield decisions never could. The call came on a Thursday morning: emergency deployment to support urban operations in Eastern Sector. One of Griffin's former students, now a platoon leader, had specifically requested him as tactical advisor. Not for command decisions or prisoner handling, but for real-time guidance during building clearance operations. The kind of support that utilized his expertise without exposing operations to his judgment. They moved out before dawn, Griffin riding in the lead vehicle with soldiers who'd learned from his instruction. The target was another apartment complex, another maze of corridors and stairwells where death waited behind every door. This time Griffin would coordinate from outside, providing tactical guidance through radio communication while younger men faced the immediate dangers. The assault went smoothly, testimony to training that had prepared these fighters for urban combat's brutal realities. But when one soldier was wounded during the final floor clearance, Griffin found himself making a choice that felt familiar. The wounded man was conscious but immobilized, enemy contact was imminent, and evacuation would require exposing additional personnel to hostile fire. Griffin keyed his radio and spoke words that surprised him with their clarity. "We don't choose who to carry, we just carry them." The evacuation proceeded without debate, successful despite tactical risk, because some principles mattered more than operational efficiency. 2 wounded soldiers came home alive that day. The flight home departed from Boryspil Airport on a gray March morning, carrying Griffin and a dozen other foreign volunteers, whose service had reached its natural conclusion. Not heroes returning in triumph, but older men who'd contributed what they could to a conflict that would outlast their individual participation. Griffin watched Ukrainian countryside disappear beneath clouds, thinking about lessons learned and prices paid. His service record would show mixed results. Tactical expertise, balanced against questionable judgment. Successful training outcomes offset by operational complications. The mathematics of institutional evaluation couldn't account for moral complexity, for choices made in basements where time was measured in heartbeats and consequences rippled forward through decades. At Denver International Airport, Griffin collected his baggage and walked through customs like any other returning traveler. No crowds waiting, no news cameras recording homecoming moments. Just an aging veteran carrying memories of young faces and difficult decisions, returning to a civilian world that hadn't paused for his absence. His apartment looked exactly as he'd left it. Dust settled on furniture that reminded him of a wife who wouldn't ask about his experiences and a son who probably wouldn't understand them. Griffin unpacked methodically, placing uniforms in closets and medals in drawers, storing equipment that might never be needed again. That evening he sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and pen, trying to capture lessons that couldn't be taught in training manuals. Words about choices made in dark places, about young men who depended on older men's wisdom, about the weight of decisions that followed soldiers home regardless of geographical distance. He was halfway through the first paragraph when footsteps approached his apartment door. Griffin opened it to find a young man in civilian clothes, early 20s, with eyes that held recent experiences of violence and loss. The visitor smiled nervously before speaking words that made Griffin's chest tighten with unexpected recognition. The young man explained that he'd served in the Ukrainian International Legion, that he'd learned urban warfare techniques from an American instructor whose training had kept him alive through 3 separate urban assaults. He'd tracked down Griffin's address to express gratitude that couldn't be conveyed through official channels. Griffin invited him inside for coffee, and they talked until dawn about wars that changed everyone who touched them, about lessons learned in places where moral complexity couldn't be resolved through tactical manuals. Some debts could never be repaid, but they could be acknowledged. Outside, Denver was waking up to another day of peace that most citizens took for granted. Griffin understood that his war was finally over. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If it resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Every word you leave helps us tell more stories like this.